Is this the thing's on? Okay, I'm getting nods. Right, so my name is Chris Holdgraf. I'm a graduate student here at Berkeley. I'm also a fellow with the Berkeley Institute for Data Science. And I'm going to sort of talk a little bit about the approach that I'm taking in my lab towards asking questions about the brain. Maybe give you a little bit of an intuition for it. And if you have any questions, then I'm happy to chat about it afterward. So one of the core questions that exists in neuroscience is trying to figure out how we can understand speech. And for most people, speech is relatively straightforward. I'm just speaking. Hopefully you're understanding the words that I'm saying. It happens almost instantaneously. You don't really have to do anything beyond learning the language in the first place in order to understand somebody else speaking. But in reality, there's a really, really complicated process that's going on in your brain anytime you're trying to understand somebody else's words. So for example, this is a plot of just like a raw sound waveform, and that's basically what's coming in through your ears. So this is in some sense the data that your brain is getting in its rawest form. And what your brain has to do is from this really, really simple one-dimensional signal that's just changing really, really quickly over time, it has to extract all of these different kinds of features from that signal. And those features go from sort of very, very simple, which I'm showing here at the top, to more and more complex and abstract here at the bottom. Eventually, you have just some idea of understanding of the words that I'm speaking. But the idea is that all of these sort of representations of speech are embedded within that raw signal up there above. And your brain has this really, really difficult computational challenge of figuring out everything that's going on there. Now, the idea as well is that each of these different kinds of features is represented in a different part of your brain. Maybe it's represented in one specific place for a certain kind of feature. Maybe it's sort of distributed all over the place for other kinds of features. But either way, one of the fundamental questions that exists in neuroscience is trying to understand how these different kinds of features of sound, of speech, are represented in the human brain. So if you're a neuroscientist, you start with a question like that, and then the next question that you have is like, how can I record data from a brain? Turns out there are lots of different ways that we can do this. All of them are sort of crappy in their own special way. In my case, we get data from a technique known as electrocorticography. Basically, this is it's a technique where you work with surgical patients who are getting surgery for intractable epilepsy. And as a part of their condition, the doctor decides that what they need to do is surgically remove the part of their brain that they think is causing these seizures. Before you can do that, you need to figure out where in the brain the origin of these seizures is, because you don't want to just go in, hacking away. And so the way to do that is to remove a part of the person's skull. You take a grid of electrodes that just record the electrical activity, and you place it directly on the surface of the brain, for example, here on the left column, or you get a little shank of electrodes and you actually insert it into the brain over here on the right column. It's actually not as invasive as it seems. It's somewhat common, but the idea is that they can get information about what's going on in the brain that may or may not underlie these seizures. What we do is we take this information and we try to ask questions about the brain using it. And the most common way that neuroscience have been asking questions for many years is you sort of have two different conditions. You want to know, how does the brain respond to sound B? So you get a whole bunch of examples of sound B, and you play them for the person. And you get a whole bunch of examples of sound A, and you play them for the person. You record the brain activity in response to each one, and then you just sort of subtract them. And you say, like, oh, I think the difference between A and B is attributable to that particular sound. But we actually take a different approach. Instead of having this sort of like tightly controlled condition A, condition B approach, we just play a bunch of natural kinds of speech. We play sentences that are more like what you would hear in everyday life. And that sort of adds some extra challenges because we don't really know exactly how to map this sort of natural, continually moving thing onto a particular region of the brain. But I think there are a lot of really good reasons for doing something like this. First of all, brains didn't evolve in an environment where you have conditions A and condition B. They're sort of expecting the world to be constantly changing all of the time. Moreover, brains are used to having very complicated stimuli that they're trying to make sense of, something like regular human speech. And a sort of traditional approach makes it more difficult to do this kind of thing with complex stimuli. And then finally, we'd like to ask lots of different questions with the same data set from the brain. And it turns out that natural speech is a really great way to do that. So as an example, This is a sample of brain activity in response to just a single spoken sentence. And you can see the color and the size of each of these dots just shows where different parts of the brain are responding to whatever the hell it is going on inside of this sound, this sentence that a person is speaking. There are all kinds of different things that the brain might be responding to. So the way that we try to make sense of this is that we define at each moment in time a collection of features of that sound that might be present at that moment in time. So maybe we can describe this sentence, say, with what's called a spectrogram of sound. We might use something like phonemes, some sort of linguistic information. We might use identities of the words themselves. And what we do then is we have this collection of sound features, which I'm showing on the left. We have some pattern of brain activity that we've recorded in response to these sounds, which I'm showing in blue. We can use machine learning to basically make predictions saying, can I use this collection of features of sound in order to generate a prediction of brain activity? In other words, do I understand how I can map sounds onto patterns of activity in the brain? Once we do that, we have both a predicted and an actual pattern of brain activity. And so we basically have a model, and we can score that model and say, where in the brain are these sounds sort of a good description of brain activity using the model that I've specified. And then the final thing that we do with this approach is we basically say, for the models that are well predictive of brain activity, can I understand something from them? So for example, here I'm going to show you 3 different electrodes. Each row is an electrode. And the plots that I'm going to show are basically ways in which that electrode is parsing different kinds of acoustic features that are present in the sound stimulus. It's just a particular way of describing speech, but it sort of tells you how this electrode is starting to probe through this really complicated raw stimulus, pull out different kinds of features, and then presumably send those features along towards the next step, in the feature extraction hierarchy. So this is just one very simple approach, one example of what you can do with this kind of model. You can ask all kinds of different questions using this kind of approach. I didn't know that this was going to be true ahead of time, but there's actually a really awesome poster that you should check out if you're interested in other kinds of questions that people can ask using the same kind of approach. You should look for a picture that looks like that on one of these posters. I think they're over there by the big room with the virtual reality cave thing. And they've done a lot it's another lab here at Berkeley that has done a lot of really awesome work in this space. And then finally, another BIDS project has been in collaboration with the Jupyter team, creating a product called Jupyter Lab. And basically, this is something that will let you play around with code that we can sort of create for you and learn a little bit about the kinds of stuff that I've been talking about. So UV has a demo for how to create your own, sorry, I said Jupyter Lab. I meant to say Jupyter Hub. That's an important difference. UV has a demo in the back for how you can get your own Jupyter Hub set up. If you go to that URL right there, though, it'll dump you into sort of a live computer environment where you can learn about a lot of the stuff that I've been talking about here. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Chris.